By the time the red frame stopped belonging to Bryan, Ohio, it had already belonged to the world. More than 150 million Etch A Sketches had been sold. Children in dozens of countries had learned the same motion with their wrists. Left knob, right knob, one line at a time, an image appearing out of silver dust and patience. It was simple enough to fit inside a toy box and famous enough to outlive the century that made it. But the easy version of this story is that Etch A Sketch was a great toy. That is true. It is also incomplete. Because Etch A Sketch was also a factory story. A small-town manufacturing story. A story about metal, ink, assembly lines, and the strange American miracle of a modest Ohio company taking a French invention and turning it into one of the most recognizable objects on Earth. And like so many of these stories, it ends the same way the others do. Not with the product disappearing, but with the place that made it losing its claim on what it created. This is the story of Ohio art, of Bryan, Ohio, of Andre Cassanes and the toy that drew perfect lines while the business behind it slowly ran out of them. If you like stories about the factories behind everyday history, subscribe to Rust and Glory. This is where we remember what industry leaves behind. The company that would one day make Etch A Sketch did not begin with toys at all. It began with a dentist. Henry S. Winsler arrived in Archbold, Ohio, in 1908 with the hands of a craftsman and the instincts of a salesman. He sold his dental practice because he believed novelty manufacturing offered a larger future than teeth. That sounds reckless until you remember what early industrial America rewarded. Not credentials, but nerve. The first Ohio art operation was small, almost improvised. Part of a band hall. About 15 women. Picture frames shipped across the country, then into Canada and Mexico. It was not glamorous work, but it was exacting. Thin sheets of metal had to be stamped, printed, painted, and finished cleanly enough that buyers would treat a cheap decorative object as something fit for the wall. Quality entered the company early because it had to. Within 4 years, the business had outgrown its first home. In 1912, local leaders in Bryan, Ohio raised the money to lure the company there with a larger factory and better shipping access. That move mattered more than it looked. Bryan was small, but it had the things small towns needed if they were going to become manufacturing towns: rail access, dependable labor, and civic willingness to bet on a factory before anyone could prove the bet would work. Soon after the move, Ohio Art installed metal lithography equipment. That decision shaped everything that followed. Lithography demanded steadiness, timing, and an eye for color registration. Sheets had to be coated, aligned, pressed, and finished with precision. The company learned how to scale beauty. It learned how to mass-produce visual appeal without making it feel disposable. That is not a small skill. It is an industrial language. The early hits now sound quaint, but they mattered. Metal picture frames, advertising signs, scale dials, decorative pieces like Cupid Awake and Cupid Asleep that sold in huge numbers. Before Etch A Sketch, Ohio Art was already proving that a Midwestern company far from New York and Chicago could make finished metal goods at a quality that held up nationally. The product category would change. The habit of making things carefully would not. Then war altered the market. When the First World War cut off imports from Germany, American toy makers suddenly had room to grow. Winsler recognized the opening quickly. Ohio Art expanded from decorative goods into toys and toy parts, then into lithographed tea sets, windmills, drums, sand pails, and eventually character merchandise. In the early 1930s, it became one of the first companies to license Disney for toys. Steamboat Willie and Mickey Mouse found their way onto bright metal surfaces printed in Northwest Ohio. That history matters because Etch A Sketch did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a company that already knew how to turn thin materials into emotional objects. Ohio Art understood packaging before the word became corporate jargon. It understood how color caught a child's eye, how repetition lowered cost, how small improvements in a factory process could become enormous advantages over time. Long before the famous red frame, the DNA was already there. Metal, ink, repetition, patience, and a belief so thoroughly Midwestern it almost disappears when you look directly at it. That even in a small town, if the workmanship is good enough, the whole world will eventually notice. The toy itself did not come from Ohio. It came from France, from a man who was not trying to become a global toy inventor. André Cassains was born in 1926 outside Paris. He worked in his family's bakery until a flour allergy made that life difficult. He turned elsewhere, toward electrical work, which is another way of saying he became the sort of person who spends long stretches looking closely at how materials behave. In 1955, while working with plastic film and electrical components, Cassains noticed something odd. Marks transferred beneath a surface because of static cling. Aluminum powder moved and settled in ways that looked almost magical. A lesser mind would have dismissed the effect as a curiosity. Cassains did what inventors do when they are paying attention. He kept playing with it until play became design. The prototype he built was called L'écran magique, the magic screen. It was not yet the Etch A Sketch people would remember. The early form used a joystick rather than two knobs. It had more of the look of a novelty television than a clean, iconic drawing toy. But the principle was already there, a stylus scraping away aluminum powder from the inside of a screen to reveal a dark line, then a shake to erase the picture and begin again. There is something moving about the humility of the invention. It was not trying to change transportation, or medicine, or warfare. It was trying to make wonder repeatable. One line, then another, until an ordinary child felt the shock of seeing a picture emerge from motion. Most toys are loud about what they offer. This one was almost silent. In 1959, Cassains carried the invention to the Nuremberg Toy Fair. Most buyers passed on it. Some thought his asking price too high. Some simply failed to understand what they were looking at. That is often how inventive objects first appear in public, not as obvious breakthroughs, but as awkward things that sit between categories long enough for cautious people to dismiss them. Ohio Art did not dismiss it. One of the company's executives saw enough in the device to take a risk. The price was $25,000. The largest amount the company had yet committed to a single new toy idea. For a small manufacturer in Bryan, Ohio, that was not a casual purchase. It was a bet large enough to matter if it failed. The Ohio engineers did not just buy the invention. They translated it. The joystick became two knobs. The shape became cleaner, friendlier, easier to understand, more toy-like and more memorable. They refined a piece of basement ingenuity into a mass-market object. Cassains supplied the spark. Bryan supplied the system that could turn the spark into millions of units. That partnership contained the whole promise and the whole sadness of modern manufacturing. The inventor imagines. The factory scales. The buyer gets a toy. The world remembers the object. And the man whose curiosity began the entire chain starts slipping out of the story almost as soon as it begins. When Etch A Sketch launched in 1960, there was nothing inevitable about its success. Success always looks inevitable after the fact because the winning product stays in the memory, while the risks that surrounded it fade. But from the point of view of Ohio Art, the company had put serious money into an unfamiliar idea and now had to prove that children would want it enough, often enough, to justify the machinery, the tooling, the marketing, and the manufacturing discipline required to keep it in stores. The price was $2.99. That mattered. It placed the toy within reach of middle-class households while keeping enough margin in the product to make the scale worthwhile if demand arrived. Ohio Art supported it with television advertising, which was not simply promotion but translation. The toy had to be explained. A child seeing the red frame for the first time needed to understand that the knobs made the picture and the shake erased it. Demonstration was part of the product. Demand arrived almost immediately. In the first year, roughly 600,000 units sold. That kind of early volume does more than generate revenue. It changes internal psychology. Suddenly, a company is no longer asking whether the product might work. It is asking how quickly the factory can keep up without losing quality. Those are different conversations. One belongs to sales. The other belongs to operations. And Ohio Art knew operations. The company had spent decades building routines around printed metal goods. Etch A Sketch demanded some different skills, but it fit the larger culture of the place. Repetition mattered. Clean assembly mattered. Cosmetic consistency mattered. A toy could not arrive looking almost right. It had to arrive exactly right every time, because the red frame itself was becoming part of the promise. The cultural timing helped. The early 1960s were still an era in which parents and retailers believed in durable, tactile toys. The screen was not fragile imagination masquerading as engineering. It was actual engineering disguised as play. Children did not just consume it. They learned its resistance. They learned that straight lines took discipline, that circles were hard, that diagonal motion required coordination. It was a drawing toy that taught your hands to think in geometry. By the time the first Christmas rush had passed, Etch A Sketch had become more than a novelty. It had become a repeatable product category inside the company. The kind every manufacturer dreams about. Not a fad that spikes and disappears, but a staple that could recur season after season, generation after generation, because its mechanism was simple, recognizable, and strangely inexhaustible. The great toy companies of the 20th century all had one or two products that escaped ordinary merchandising and entered household language. Slinky, Play-Doh, Barbie, Legos. Etch A Sketch made that jump because it was not tied to a story universe or a single licensed character. It was tied to a gesture. Turn, draw, shake, begin again. That made it portable across decades in a way trend-driven toys rarely are. And from Bryan's point of view, that was the beginning of something even larger than sales. The company had stumbled into a product that would soon make the town itself legible to the outside world. A factory in Northwest Ohio had started making a toy that could travel almost anywhere. When that happens, a place stops thinking of itself as local. It begins, quietly, to think of itself as the origin of something global. Factories become myths slowly. First they are just employers. Then they become landmarks. Then their products circulate so widely that people start measuring the town through the thing it makes. That was what happened in Bryan. The company address itself eventually carried the sort of storybook neatness no branding consultant could have invented better. One Toy Street. The town square displayed a giant Etch A Sketch. The local paper reported milestones with the tone usually reserved for athletic championships or wartime homecomings. Every new sales figure was not merely a corporate result. It was an affirmation that Bryan still mattered to the wider world. In small manufacturing towns, the export of a product often becomes the import of identity. The thing leaves. The pride returns. For workers, this feeling was more intimate. The toy was not abstract to them. It was a set of repeated motions, known by touch and timing. Parts arriving. Frames aligned. Screens installed. powder sealed, knobs fitted, packaging stacked. The kind of work that becomes bodily knowledge after enough years. You do not need to romanticize factory labor to understand that repetition at that level creates expertise. It trains the hand and the eye into habits that are difficult to describe and even harder to replace once broken. Ohio art was not a giant. That is part of what made the story powerful. The company sat between the American myth of the family business and the reality of industrial scale. It was large enough to fill trucks and shelves and holiday catalogs, but still local enough that people knew who owned it, who managed it, who had worked there 20 years, who was about to retire, whose son had just started, whose daughter had moved from one department to another. The line between company and community was thin. By the end of the century, the town had reason to boast. Etch A Sketch had sold across 67 countries. It had passed 150 million units. In 1998, it entered the National Toy Hall of Fame. Those are not just milestones. They are proofs of durability. Products that last long enough become measuring devices for time itself. Parents remember them from their own childhood and buy them again. Grandparents recognize them on shelves and tell stories. A toy does not need to remain dominant if it remains legible across generations. Bryan began to live inside that continuity. The town was no longer only a point on a map in Northwest Ohio. It was the place that made Etch A Sketch. That kind of identity can be stabilizing, but it can also be dangerous, because the town begins to trust the permanence of a product more than the economics beneath it deserve. This is how factory myths turn double-edged. The stronger the local pride, the more difficult it becomes to imagine that the underlying system could ever be moved, hollowed out, sold, or detached from the town that gave it meaning. When a community believes it makes something the whole world loves, it begins to think that love is protection. It usually is not. For a long stretch, though, Bryan had every reason to believe the bond would hold. The toy was famous. The company still had roots. The workforce still had pride. The line still ran. If you had stood in town at the height of it and asked what Etch A Sketch was, you would not have gotten a corporate answer. You would have gotten the local one. It was what Bryan did. Part of Etch A Sketch's durability came from the fact that it never needed a complicated story to justify itself. It was its own demonstration. Still, the mechanism deserves attention because the mechanism was the miracle. Behind the glass was a powder-fine aluminum dust distributed across the inside of the screen. A stylus moved beneath the surface. The knobs pulled that stylus horizontally and vertically through a system of rods, wires, and rails. Wherever the stylus passed, it scraped the powder away, exposing a darker line beneath. That is all. And because that is all, it feels almost impossible the first time you see it. No ink. No electronics. No batteries. No external marks touching the drawing surface at all. Just movement translated into lines. The toy turns invisible mechanics into visible thought. That is why it always felt slightly more serious than a novelty. It was not pretending to create. It was actually converting action into image. Children discovered the rule immediately. One knob for left and right, one for up and down. Adults discovered the limit just as quickly. There was no undo except destruction. Shake the toy and the whole drawing vanished at once. That mattered psychologically. An Etch A Sketch teaches impermanence with unusual bluntness. One slip and a line lands where you do not want it. One shake and the entire work disappears. In that sense, it is a toy of both patience and loss. There is another reason it lasted. Unlike many toys of its era, it contained a built-in drama of mastery. A child could begin with scribbles, then learned squares, then stairsteps, then letters, then recognizable houses and faces. The toy never changed, but the user did. It rewarded returning to it. That made it much harder to outgrow than parents or competitors expected. Manufacturing such a simple device at scale required care that simplicity often hides. The screen had to read cleanly. The powder had to distribute consistently. The knobs had to turn with the right amount of resistance. Too loose and the toy felt cheap. Too stiff and the illusion of drawing broke. Much of manufacturing quality lives in that space. Not in whether the thing technically works, but in whether it feels right in the hand. Ohio Art understood that instinctively. This is one reason the toy translated so well internationally. You did not need language to understand the interface. Turn, draw, shake. Almost no packaging explanation required. The object could travel into homes across cultures because it asked so little from the buyer at the point of use and gave so much back in the form of discovery. The red frame was iconic, but the mechanics were what made the icon durable. And then there was the image of the toy itself as a machine for imagination. It looked vaguely industrial without appearing threatening. A little window, a frame, two knobs, the child at the controls. In an era defined by televisions, dashboards, dials, and domestic appliances, Etch A Sketch felt modern in a way children could operate directly. It let them touch the machine age without being subjected to it. That was the deeper magic. The toy looked simple because the engineering was hidden. The company in Bryan did what the best manufacturers always do. It converted complexity into ease and let the customer experience only the pleasure of control. When a product becomes iconic, people tend to remember the advertising, the packaging, the celebrity cameos, the scenes from films. They forget the floor. But the floor is where the real story lives. At Ohio Art, Etch A Sketch passed through a chain of operations that only looked modest from a distance. Every finished unit was a small choreography of materials, tolerances, checks, and accumulated human habit. The company's older identity in lithographed metal never entirely disappeared. Even as plastics and new materials changed the toy industry, Ohio Art still carried a manufacturing culture shaped by printing, alignment, finish quality, and disciplined assembly. Workers were not improvising craft objects one by one. They were executing repeatability at scale, which is its own form of craft. At peak periods, especially around the holidays, the pressure became visible in the rhythm of the building. More units, more shifts, more pallets moving, more quality checks. The toy was simple enough that consumers often imagined it as effortless. Factories rarely get credit for making simplicity look easy. But this was a product sold by the hundreds of thousands and then by the millions. The line had to stay clean, fast, and consistent, or the whole economics of the toy fell apart. What a place like that produces, over time, is not merely output. It produces a local grammar. Certain people know this machine. Others know that station. One worker hears a slight mismatch in resistance and knows a batch is off before the paperwork catches up. Another can spot cosmetic inconsistency at a glance from years of looking at the same red frame under slightly different lighting. This is the kind of knowledge that lives in workers and disappears more quickly than managers expect when lines are moved. It also produces memory. Families in Bryan and the surrounding area did not experience Ohio Art as a logo. They experienced it as a source of schedules, wages, jokes, frustrations, retirement clocks, holiday overtime, and stories told at dinner. A factory gives a town conversation topics, even to people who have never worked there, because someone they know has. That is how industrial work becomes part of the civic texture. By the late 20th century, Ohio Art's success with Etch A Sketch could look almost permanent. It was in the Hall of Fame. It had endured television, fashion shifts, changing packaging, and the first waves of electronic competition. It had even survived long enough to become self-conscious Americana. That is often the most dangerous stage for an industrial product, the point when it feels too familiar to fail. Because on the floor, permanence is never guaranteed. Machines age. Margins tighten. Buyers consolidate. Retailers demand impossible pricing. Freight costs change. Material costs shift. Competitors copy. Children move toward new forms of entertainment. None of that is visible in the mythology of a red frame. All of it is visible in the accounting behind it. The tragedy of places like Bryan is that the better the product works in the culture, the easier it becomes for outsiders to assume the factory will simply keep existing in the background, the way electricity exists in the background. It does not. Somebody, somewhere, is always deciding whether the line stays where it is. Few products get a second life in the culture after their first great wave has passed. Etch A Sketch managed it more than once. That says something about the product, but it also says something about the fragility of a company trying to survive on a mix of nostalgia and timing. Because each burst of renewed attention felt, from the outside, like proof of durability. Inside the books, it often looked more like borrowed time. Ohio Art did not simply sit on the classic toy and hope memory would do the work. In the 1980s, the company tried to innovate into electronics with the Etch A Sketch animator. On paper, the move made sense. Children were being pulled toward digital play. Screens were becoming more central. If the company could carry the Etch A Sketch identity into animation, maybe it could bridge old and new. But markets do not care whether an idea makes sense on paper if bigger players already own the category in the public mind. The Animator and Animator 2000 showed ambition, but they arrived into a world increasingly defined by video game companies that did electronic entertainment at a scale Ohio Art could not match. Nintendo and Sega were not selling a variation on a drawing toy. They were selling entire ecosystems of attention. Against that, an inventive electronic offshoot from Bryan was always going to struggle. Then Pixar gave the company something it could never have bought at the same scale with advertising dollars, a moment of emotional re-entry. In 1995, Etch A Sketch appeared in Toy Story. The scene was brief, but brief does not mean minor. A generation of parents who already knew the toy saw it again in a story about the emotional life of playthings. Children who had never touched one suddenly recognized it as part of the toy universe that mattered. Sales rose. Revenue surged. The line sped up again. This is the cruel part. A cultural revival can revive sales without fixing structure. The product becomes visible again, but the company beneath it remains exposed to the same pressures as before. That is what happened here. The Toy Story lift helped, then faded. Another Pixar appearance helped again, then faded again. Holiday numbers jumped. But the balance sheet remained under strain. A hit cameo is not a business model. It is a weather event. By the late 1990s, Ohio Art was already fighting on several fronts at once. Changing consumer tastes, shrinking margins, product recalls, dependence on large retailers, and debt. Auditors were warning about the future. The company was no longer just managing a beloved toy line. It was trying to survive the larger restructuring of American manufacturing and toy retail under conditions that favored scale, lower labor costs, and ruthless price competition. From the outside, though, Bryan still had reasons to celebrate. The Hall of Fame induction in 1998. The sales milestones. The civic symbolism. This is what makes local factory stories so emotionally unstable. A town can be publicly celebrating an icon at almost the exact moment the underlying economics are turning decisively against the place that made it. In other words, Etch A Sketch was not failing as an object. It was succeeding in the culture, while the system that had manufactured its success in Bryan was starting to give way underneath it. Those are two different realities, and they can coexist longer than anyone wants to admit. There is a sentence that appears, in one form or another, in almost every factory closure story of the last half-century. The decision made sense on paper. It is a sentence that does not comfort anyone who loses a job. But it is usually true, or true enough, which is part of what makes these stories hard. They are not always morality plays. Often they are collisions between a local order built over generations and a market order that feels no obligation to honor it. By the late 1990s, Ohio art was under pressure from debt and from the retail environment itself. Big box buying power, especially from chains like Walmart, changed the arithmetic for manufacturers. Price discipline was no longer a negotiation with many independent stores. It was increasingly a negotiation with giants who expected lower and lower costs while treating a branded product as interchangeable with whatever supplier could satisfy margin demands at scale. That sort of pressure falls hardest on companies whose brand is famous but whose manufacturing base is comparatively expensive. Ohio art still had pride, history, and identity in Bryan. What it did not have was the kind of labor cost structure that could survive indefinitely if retailers insisted on a global race to the bottom and consumers still expected the shelf price to stay invitingly low. The company's financial position made patience harder. A large credit line was already under strain. Revenue swings tied to media exposure were not solving the core problem. They were masking it briefly. This is the pattern in so many manufacturing declines, a few moments of apparent reprieve that lead local communities to believe the worst might have passed, when in reality management is only buying enough time to decide which part of the old model must be cut away first. And for Bryan, the part that was cut away first was the part that mattered most: production itself. In 2001, the last Etch A Sketch rolled off the line in Bryan. The equipment was crated and shipped to Shenzhen. On paper, the move helped profitability. Ohio art reported a strong profit afterward. That is not surprising. Lower production costs generally do exactly what management says they will do in the short term. But factories are not short-term instruments to the people who work in them. They are life structures. The line in Bryan had not only produced toys. It had produced routine, skill, community, and a sense of local distinction. When the equipment left, what left with it was not just a product line. It was a reason for the town to feel that it had made something the world needed from right where it stood. Accounts from that period carry the right emotional weight because they do not try to overdramatize. The tears at the dinner after the equipment was loaded. The sense that the numbers worked while something harder to measure did not. That phrasing matters because it captures the industrial age's last insult to many towns. Profitability can be restored in the same stroke that local meaning is removed. The toy survived. The community bond did not survive in the same form. And that is the modern bargain in its bluntest expression. The product keeps its name, the buyer keeps the margin, the place that built the reputation becomes a footnote. When journalists and executives talk about offshoring, they usually talk in categories: units, margins, price points, competitiveness, global supply chains. What moved overseas in 2001 was not just a toy line. It was a body of practical knowledge, some of it documented, much of it not. The most dangerous business illusion is that if a process can be described, it can be transplanted without remainder. That is rarely true. A long-time worker knows more than the instruction sheet. A supervisor knows where problems tend to appear before the defects are visible. A quality employee senses from the feel of a finished object whether a batch is subtly wrong. The company that moves a line may preserve the formal method and still lose the informal intelligence that made the method stable. This does not always show up immediately. Sometimes it shows up months later in minor inconsistencies or slower troubleshooting. Sometimes it is simply absorbed as a hidden cost of transition. For Bryan, though, the more immediate damage was emotional and civic. Around 100 direct jobs were lost according to contemporary reporting, though the broader local sense of loss ran much deeper because the move represented not just payroll reduction but symbolic demotion. The town that had once been the unquestioned home of the toy would now remain the place in the story only as origin, not as ongoing maker. That distinction matters. People are often told to take pride in having invented or once produced something, even after the making has been relocated. But invention and production are not the same. Production is what keeps a place alive in the present tense. Without it, the town is left to remember itself historically, while the product continues elsewhere in the ordinary time of commerce. This is why the line that the math worked but the soul did not feels less like rhetoric than diagnosis. The company could point to profit improvement. Critics could point to job loss. Both were right. The deeper question was whether the company could still claim continuity with the town in the same way, once the thing that defined that continuity was no longer assembled there. The answer, in practice, was no. Factories do not only make goods. They distribute dignity. They give workers proof that what they know how to do has value in the market and in the community. When a famous line leaves, the damage is not exhausted by unemployment. It reaches into civic imagination. Young people start assuming the serious work will happen somewhere else. Older workers begin measuring time in befores and afters. The building stays, but the meaning thins out. Ohio art itself did not vanish after the move. The company refocused on metal lithography and kept operating in Bryan. That fact is important because it stops the story from collapsing into a simple morality play. The move was not pure abandonment. It was a narrowing, a choice about what part of the company could continue locally and what part could not. Those are often the hardest stories to tell because partial survival can feel, from the outside, less dramatic than total closure while still being locally transformative. Bryan did not become a ghost town, but it ceased to be the active manufacturing home of the toy that had made it famous. That is enough to change how a place hears its own name. By 2016, the final separation came. Ohio Art sold the Etch A Sketch and Doodle Sketch brands to Spin Master. Formally, the reasoning was clear. The sale would allow Ohio Art to focus on its metal lithography business and invest in manufacturing operations in Bryan. Strategically, this was understandable. Companies under prolonged pressure often decide that brand stewardship is a luxury compared with operational focus. If a famous line is no longer the right center of the business, it becomes an asset to be monetized. But famous lines are rarely experienced by towns as assets. They are experienced as inheritances. The Kilgallen family, which had held the company for generations, was not dealing with a trivial product line. They were dealing with the most recognizable object ever associated with Bryan, Ohio. To sell it was to acknowledge that whatever link remained between the town and the toy had become too economically fragile to sustain through ownership alone. This is why the language around the sale was bittersweet rather than triumphant. People involved understood exactly what was being let go. Not only rights and trademarks, but a long period of family stewardship over something that had become, for many Americans, indistinguishable from childhood itself. You can understand the necessity and still feel the surrender. From Spin Master's perspective, the acquisition made perfect sense. Etch A Sketch remained iconic. Iconicity in the toy business is extremely hard to create, and comparatively easy to maintain if the core object still works. A company with global marketing strength and portfolio scale could keep the brand visible without carrying the emotional obligations that Ohio Art carried in Bryan. To an acquirer, that is attractive. You get the recognition without the local burden of history. And this is where brand capitalism becomes especially cold. Once a product reaches a certain level of symbolic durability, the name can become more transportable than the people, the town, and even the factory tradition that produced it. The brand can survive detached from origin because the consumer relationship is with the object and the story around it, not with the specific workers or the specific line that once made it. This does not mean the old custodians were wrong to sell. It means that by the time the sale happened, the industrial era in which local stewardship and local manufacturing naturally reinforced one another had already been broken. Ohio Art's leaders were not ending that era. They were responding to the fact that it had already ended. Still, a town feels the symbolism sharply. The product that once made Bryan visible to the world would now continue entirely elsewhere, under other owners, within other strategic priorities. The original company would persist, but the famous toy that had once drawn children's imaginations and the town's civic pride together under one name would no longer belong to it. There are endings more dramatic than that. There are not many more modern. Every mass-market icon leaves a trail of people who do not stay proportionate to what they made possible. Andre Cassains is one of them. He died in 2013. Millions knew the toy. Very few knew his name. Even the American patent history around the product complicates his place in the public record. Another name appeared on the United States patent. Cassains, the French electrician whose basement experimentation produced the entire mechanism, did not become the figure most consumers associated with the invention. This happens often enough in industrial history that it almost becomes invisible. The inventor is necessary but not sufficient. The company that scales the object becomes the public face. The toy reaches shelves. Advertising takes over. The market memory of who made the thing begins to collapse into the market memory of who sold it. By the time the product becomes iconic, the original act of noticing, that first spark of curiosity in 1955, has already become hard to recover from within the brand's story. There is something fitting, if melancholy, about this in the case of Etch A Sketch. The toy itself erases. It wipes clean and begins again. Over time, the culture did something similar to its own origin. The lines that led back to Cassains became fainter, then faint enough that only specialists and serious enthusiasts kept them visible. And yet his kind of invention is exactly the sort that deserves remembrance, not only because it sold well, but because it reveals how human curiosity works. He was not a corporate research team. He was one man paying attention to an effect most people would ignore. He did not invent out of a strategy deck. He invented out of fascination. That matters, because industrial history is full of breakthroughs that begin not with scale, but with a person noticing something small and refusing to stop there. Bryan's story is entangled with his. Without Cassains, there is no Etch A Sketch. Without Ohio Art, there is no global Etch A Sketch. Without Bryan, there is no factory town identity built around the toy. The full story belongs to all three. But popular memory rarely keeps balance so neatly. It prefers the visible object. The red frame wins again. That imbalance gives the ending an extra sting. The toy outlasted the inventor in public memory. It outlasted the town's production line. It outlasted its original corporate stewardship. It may outlast all of them by another century. Durability in the marketplace often comes at the cost of clarity about origins. What survives, if anything, is the chance to retell the story properly. To put the French electrician back into the frame. To remember that behind the toy sat a sequence of very specific people, very specific decisions, and a factory culture that was never inevitable simply because it happened. An object can become timeless and still owe everything to time-bound hands. When people say a town lost a factory, they sometimes make it sound as though what vanished was only payroll. Payroll matters. Jobs matter. But what a place like Bryan lost when Etch A Sketch stopped being made there was denser than that. It lost a present-tense role in a story the whole world still recognized. That is a harder loss to calculate, which is why balance sheets usually do not try. Identity in industrial towns is rarely abstract. It is practical. It answers questions children absorb without hearing them asked. What do people make here? What does this place know how to do? What leaves town because of us? For a long time, Bryan had an answer few towns could match. A toy in living rooms around the world began here. The town was not just a hometown. It was a source. After production moved and ownership changed, the source became historical rather than current. The memory stayed. The active claim weakened. The giant Etch A Sketch in the square still made sense as tribute, but tribute is not the same as participation. This is the difference between a museum relationship to industry and a living one. A museum says we once mattered this way. A working factory says we still do. And yet it would be wrong to end only in elegy. Ohio art did not vanish. The company leaned into metal lithography and remained in Bryan. The community did not cease to exist because one iconic line moved elsewhere. Places are sturdier than single products, even when the product seems to define them for outsiders. What changed was not whether Bryan existed. What changed was the terms on which it recognized itself. Etch A Sketch also remains bigger than the local story. It still works. Children still learn the awkward grace of turning both knobs together and discovering that diagonals are harder than they look. Artists still push the toy far beyond its intended simplicity. Pop culture still reaches for it whenever a film, a joke, or a visual shorthand needs to evoke childhood, persistence, or analog magic. That is the paradox at the center of this whole history. The more universal the toy became, the easier it was for the world to keep loving it without caring where it was made. Bryan, on the other hand, could not separate the thing from the place nearly so easily. For the town, the object had always been attached to work, to wages, to family memory, to a specific factory floor and a specific local pride. So the true end of the story is not that Etch A Sketch died. It did not. The true end is that Bryan no longer gets to speak in the same voice when the toy enters the room. The product survives, but the town's authorship of the present tense does not survive in the same way. And that may be the most modern ending of all. A beloved object still on shelves. A community still on the map. A company still alive in another form. The lines continue. But the hands that once drew them from Bryan, Ohio, are gone from the mechanism forever. In the old industrial towns, people sometimes speak about factories as if they were weather. They set the day. They shape the week. They determine the mood of a place without anyone needing to say it out loud. Ohio art once did that for Bryan. Not alone, not absolutely, but enough that the town could feel itself reflected in a toy sold around the world. Etch A Sketch offered children a blank surface and two knobs and trusted them to find an image hidden inside the motion. The history behind it is not so different. You turn the story one way and see invention. Turn it another and see manufacturing discipline. Turn it again and you see debt, retail pressure, outsourcing, a sale, an inventor nearly erased from the patent memory, and a town trying to hold on to pride after production has gone. What remains is not just a red frame. It is a lesson. Simple objects are rarely simple histories. Somewhere behind almost every beloved product sits a place that once made it with care, and then discovered that care, however real, was not sufficient protection against the larger logic of the market. Bryan, Ohio learned that. Andre Cassanes learned it in another way. Ohio art lived it in balance sheets and shifts and strategic necessity. And the rest of us keep drawing lines on the surface of the story, trying to decide what exactly disappeared when the toy stopped belonging to the town that made it famous. Shake the frame and the picture vanishes. The toy has always known that. The people who built it had to learn it the harder way.